East Hearts Radio.
You're listening to East Hearts Radio.
I love the music, takes me back to when I was younger. It's just a good music mix and you can sing along, it's all sort of happy times, and yeah, I love it.
It's the best local station.
East Hearts Radio, your local community radio station.
Local radio by local people.
For more details, visit our website, eastheartsradio.co.uk.
You're listening to East Hearts Radio.
Hi everyone, welcome to East Hearts Radio. My name is Josh. You are listening to In Discussion with Josh Dean and Sophie Massey. Good evening to my co-host Sophie.
Hiya.
We are joined this evening by some really interesting, fantastic guests. We're going to be talking a lot about what they do in the community, the impact that coronavirus had on them and their line of work, and how they feel that we can rebuild our community. So I'll introduce each of our guests. First, we have Jo. Hi, Jo.
Hi.
And if you could tell our listeners a little bit about where you're from and what you do.
Hi, my name's Jo. I actually run a community interest company called Always Be You, and we support 36 adults in East Hearts with learning disabilities and their families. We give them respite and we provide social activities and work training for those people.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jo. We're looking forward to hearing more about it throughout the show. We've got Tina Bartois. Tina, good to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
And a little bit about what you do and what you're involved in the community for our listeners.
Okay, so I'm from Letchworth and I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees for the North Hearts and Stevenage Centre for Voluntary Service. We have a large membership of local community and voluntary sector organisations, as well as running some key services ourselves, including the Reach Out project, the Team Hearts volunteering project, play schemes for children with complex needs called Breakaway, and a community transport scheme.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Tina. And finally, we have Gabby Wild, who has been on the air a few times at East Hearts Radio. Hello, Gabby.
Hiya, you're right.
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about what you do as well.
So I am a student journalist from Ware. At the minute, I'm at uni, just training to finish my degree, but I've done a bit of work with East Hearts Radio and a bit with the Hertfordshire Mercury over the past year.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gabby. So tonight we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on our community. It's a topic we've covered a few times on shows that I've done in the past. I know it's something that East Hearts Radio have talked about before. But what we're going to look at today is really how coronavirus has impacted our community, particularly, through the perspective of the guests that we have on. And then we're going to look in the second half of the show about how we can go forward from here and rebuild our community now that, the vaccine is rolling out and we've got an end in sight. So we're going to jump in. Whoever wants to jump in first, feel free, raise a hand or just shout. But what do you think the impact of COVID-19 has been on our community, particularly, from the perspective of the work that you do? Go on, over to you, Jo.
It's been devastating for our project. As soon as COVID happened, we were really struggling as a company because we've only been going for just under 2 years. And we realised that we weren't going to get any grants from the government. So our income completely stopped immediately. So I was really concerned that we were going to have to close our project down, and it was devastating for all the people that we support.
Radio.
I love the music. Takes me back to when I was younger. It's just a good music mix, and you can sing along. It's all sort of happy times, and yeah, I love it.
It's the best local station.
East Hearts Radio, your local community radio station.
Local radio by local people.
For more details, visit our website, eastheartsradio.co.uk.
You're listening to East Hearts Radio.
Hi everyone, welcome to East Hearts Radio. My name is Josh. You are listening to In Discussion with Josh Dean and Sophie Massey. Good evening to my co-host Sophie.
Hiya.
We are joined this evening by some really interesting, fantastic guests. We're going to be talking a lot about what they do in the community, the impact that coronavirus had on them and their line of work, and how they feel that we can rebuild our community. So I'll introduce each of our guests. First, we have Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
And if you could tell our listeners a little bit about where you're from and what you do.
Hi, my name's Jo. I actually run a community interest company called Always Be You, and we support 36 adults in East Hearts with learning disabilities and their families. We give them respite, and we provide social activities and work training for those people.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Joe. We're looking forward to hearing more about it throughout the show. We've got Tina Bartois. Tina, good to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
And a little bit about what you do and what you're involved in the community for our listeners.
Okay, so I'm from Letchworth, and I'm the vice chair of the board of trustees for the North Hearts and Stevenage Centre for Voluntary Service. We have a large membership of local community and voluntary sector organisations, as well as running some key services ourselves, including the Reach Out project, the Team Hearts volunteering project, play schemes for children with complex needs called Breakaway, and a community transport scheme.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Tina. And finally, we have Gabby Wild, who has been on the air a few times at East Hearts Radio. Hello, Gabby.
Hiya, you're right.
I'm all right, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So tell us a little bit about what you do as well.
So I am a student journalist from Ware. At the minute, I'm at uni, just training to finish my degree, but I've done a bit of work with East Hearts Radio and a bit with the Hertfordshire Mercury over the past year.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gabby. So tonight we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on our community. It's a topic we've covered a few times on shows that I've done in the past. I know it's something that East Hearts Radio have talked about before. But what we're going to look at today is really how coronavirus has impacted our community, particularly, through the perspective of the guests that we have on. And then we're going to look in the second half of the show about how we can go forward from here and rebuild our community now that, the vaccine is rolling out and we've got an end in sight. So we're gonna jump in. Whoever wants to jump in first, feel free, raise a hand or just shout. But what do you think the impact of COVID-19 has been on our community, particularly, from the perspective of the work that you do? Go on, over to you, Jo.
It's been devastating for our project. As soon as COVID happened, we were really struggling as a company because we've only been going for just under 2 years. And we realised that we weren't going to get any grants from the government. So our income completely stopped immediately. So I was really concerned that we were going to have to close our project down, and it was devastating for all the people that we support. So also our people are used to going out in the community, and we provide social activities twice a week. We provide work experience. We do, people go out and they're socialising. We take them out for meals. We do belly dancing, singing lessons, all of those kind of things. Really fantastic things out in the community, and they all had to stop. And so everyone, all of a sudden, we have 36 people who are at home and isolated. And also some of those people had families, they were living with their families who were therefore then giving 24-hour support. and having no respite whatsoever. So it was very, very difficult, and people were very, very isolated. And we really, really struggled at the beginning, but we really, really have managed to overcome that. And I'll talk about that later.
Fantastic. I'm curious to hear as well about, obviously, if you weren't given government grants, were you supported by the local council or local authorities, or was it something that you had to sort of drive through yourself?
We had to think about the way we were working. We had to drive through ourselves, but we were extremely lucky. We've been very well supported by Ware Town Council, and we've been able to get some funding from them. We've also just applied for some funding for East Herts community grants. We've managed to get some funding there, and also Sports England and the lottery, but we've really had to write those bids very quickly. But there was no support in the beginning from government, so we've had to find those that funding.
I'm interested to hear as well, obviously, because, and it's fantastic to hear that the local council's been so proactive on this in Ware especially, and I know that in Ware the local council is running a COVID relief scheme at the moment, which is really good. Tina, obviously you sort of work in the sort of voluntary section, voluntary area as well. What's your experience been?
So I think it's really amazing how much like the voluntary sector has achieved at this really difficult time. We've really stepped up and made things happen in terms of the North Herts and Stevenage CVS. We've had to change the way that we work, and a lot of our efforts have been directed towards the COVID-19 support. And yeah, it's been hard. I mean, for so many voluntary organisations at the moment, they're struggling and things are on hold because they can't deliver the services they usually would. And it's generally quite hard for small charities and community groups to access funding as it is, because they don't have the means to be able to tender for a contract. And yeah, it's a difficult thing.
I'm going to bring Sophie in at this point as well, because I know you're working at the moment, aren't you?
I am, yeah. I work as a teaching assistant, so I'm in every day.
And what's that like at the moment?
I think the hardest part about it is because I work in early years. Mm-hmm. The hardest part is trying to explain to the children that they can't hug their friends, and just kind of seeing how much that's affected them. And then as you go further up the school, the children that do understand have started to almost take on the stress of their parents, of the teachers, of everyone trying to obviously keep them safe. And to know that, I mean, obviously there was the U-turn at the beginning of this term, with government sending the children in for just one day, which put everybody in danger, which was completely irrational and unreasonable in my opinion. And I think where schools have been messed around so much with no regard to the health of teachers, teaching assistants, cleaners, like everyone that works in a school, including the children, it's definitely taken a massive toll in terms of young people's mental health. Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's worrying.
I want to pick up on a few points there in a minute as well, because I think I want to have a bit of a discussion about free school meals, but also about the provision of digital education for children in our community. But first, I'm going to bring in Gabby, because you are obviously a student as well. What's that experience like for you?
It's interesting because obviously I'm not really getting the student experience at all, and all of my lectures are online, and I'm training to be a journalist, so usually we have sort of a newsroom where everything's active in the same way as a newsroom you'd have at the BBC or anything like that, and we're having to do it all online. So like this week we've been doing a radio newsroom, and it's just a completely different thing. But I think when you look at the impact of this on our community, there's like mixed things really, because obviously it's been really devastating in some ways, but then also you've seen people and charities really step up and do really well in sort of trying to help out the community. So for example, there's a woman from Hertford, Sue Dawson, who's made hundreds and hundreds of sandwiches and delivered them to the Royal London Hospital for the NHS workers. And doing interviews like that for me as a journalist is really, really nice, because I'm talking to people who are sort of doing really well and getting more involved in the communities than they would have done before.
I think it's interesting because you've got I think you've got a real sort of juxtaposition, if that's the word, where you've got local businesses, local charities, voluntary organisations, and residents really sort of coming together to support one another and keep the community moving. In a town like mine, in Hertford as well, that couldn't be more obvious. And that's sort of been the case for the past few years as well, where our local businesses have sort of kept the community moving through years of delay on our town centre redevelopment. And so I think you can see a continuation of that throughout coronavirus. But I think as well, there's been U-turns, which I don't think it's unfair to say, that have left a lot of people in the lurch. I think there's been a lot of uncertainty. And I think, the lockdown we're in now wasn't a situation many of us really expected to be in again. Certainly not one that we wanted to be in. I'm certainly not enjoying it too much, although I don't mind not going out when it's as cold as it is outside. I think I can live with that. But I wanted to ask sort of how you each felt you'd been supported as well. And I know, Joe, that we touched on that with you earlier. Do you feel like the majority of your support came from, sort of local authorities, the government, sort of these kinds of figures? Or do you feel like there was this real sort of groundswell of support in the community as well?
To be honest, we have some amazing volunteers. I'm so lucky in the organisation that I work with, because we all genuinely really care about the people that we support and we want to do the best by them. So we've managed to do things like we raised £1,000 on GoFundMe to provide activity packs to all of the guys that were at home, 36 people in their houses, some of them living on their own. And we've been taking volunteers out, driving to people's houses and delivering activity packs with song sheets and sweets and quizzes and fun things to do in them. And we've had shops donate. Mr. Sims in Ware, he's amazing. He's donated sweets to us. We've had people donate their time, their money. We're doing a doorstop cafe at the moment, and we're going to deliver tea and cakes and to people, to all of our guys who need to see somebody. We also have had the Southern Maltings in Ware. They've been doing some art classes for our guys online, so to make sure that they get to see each other. The community have been amazing for us. We have yoga teachers who are teaching yoga to our group so that they get some well-being and some downtime, and it's fantastic. And so it's volunteers really that have supported us the most. And we've been lucky enough to apply for grants, which is amazing. And I have to say, Ware Town Council have been brilliant. And also East Herts Community Fund has allowed us to do the doorstop cafe. But, the general public have been amazing, and I'm so grateful for their support.
I'm really curious to hear as well about when the lockdown came in, how you sort of responded as an organisation, and how did the process of reorganising the sort of activities and things you could do, how did that play out?
We had to look at the government legislation, which was really tricky, because every few weeks it was like a yo-yo situation where there were certain things that we could do and certain things that we couldn't. So we adapted, because things like we were renting Southern Maltings, and we had to, we got a temperature gun, we got hand sanitizers, and we had to adapt to everything that we needed. But really, it came from us and our volunteers and our organisation and people that wanted to help.
I think we've seen, such a. I completely agree that it can be so difficult to go through the government guidance, which does have to change so regularly. I'm going to bring Sophie in because I think I know Sophie's got a question.
I'm just interested to know that obviously there has been an overwhelming amount of U-turns given by the government in terms of guidelines, in terms of lockdowns, and obviously schools going back and everything. I'm just interested to see how that has affected how everything has run for you.
For me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. It has been very difficult because at short notice we were having to close our organisation, and then we were also having to work on the new guidelines. So sometimes the new guidelines would say that we could work as a support group and we could only have 15 people attend our club sessions. And then there would be a new bit of legislation coming in. It was really, really hard to keep up with all the legislation and know that you were doing the right thing. But we have managed to do that, and we have managed to keep our services opening because we actually really, really care, and we want those people to get the services that they deserve and families to get the respite that they really need. So it's a real determination from our part, really, to want to support those people that we really do genuinely care about.
I think it's really important as well. It's voluntary organisations like yours that are so vital. The services you provide are so vital, not just through the pandemic, but year round as well. And I think especially now where there are, people that need support in the community, the people that you work with, you look at the other voluntary groups around East Hearts, especially the, groups around providing support to people who are isolated with coronavirus. We've really seen how important voluntary work is and how willing people in the community are to help as well. I want to come back to that point about guidance. And I want to turn to Sophie again for this, because you'll have seen this firsthand, working in a school. Obviously, there's been changes of government guidance. You mentioned earlier about when children were sent back into school and then sent back home again. I really want to hear what you think about the impact of that on schools, not just in terms of staff, but also, children and families as well.
I think sending the children back for just one day anyway was incredibly irresponsible. And I think that actually it was unfair because children, after have not seen their friends, will come back, see their friends. And then most importantly, everyone will mix. So I will have mixed with other staff members. The children would have mixed with the staff members and then each other. And if you are a child who has come into school and say at home you've got a member of the family that is an incredibly at-risk member of society, then you are risking essentially their lives by going into school and coming home again. And I think that is an incredibly unfair burden to put on a child without them really understanding it.
I think it's I don't think any child should have to be as worried about going into school as some of the people that I've seen. I've got a younger brother, and he was worried about going into school, not particularly loving online learning. I don't think, and I don't know if a lot of students really are. I've got a friend who works in a school. He's a primary school teacher. And just the level of work that he's having to do, additional work, is unbelievable. And there's so much that goes into it. And I think you sort of have a situation where there's a certain amount of pressure that is going to be placed on students, teachers, the rest of the staff, families anyway. But then there's additional pressure that I feel really strongly could have been avoided. I've been very, very outspoken on free school meals. I've written to our local MP, and I've been really concerned about, whether or not free school meals are going to go ahead. It seems like 1 minute they are, 1 minute they're not. You've got, Marcus Rashford stepping in every other month because families don't know what's going to happen. I want to see what everyone here just thought about. How do they feel about the way that the free school meal situation has been handled? And I'm gonna open that up to anyone who wants to come in. Go on, Tina.
So, from a personal perspective, when I was younger, I was on free school meals, and that was really tough. And I can't imagine like the amount of, the worry that's been caused by the fact that we don't know what's going on, and it is happening really regularly. And I don't think the fact that there is, this global pandemic is being as seriously factored into the whole thing the government are doing as it should. In terms of, like, I've also been really outspoken on this, and I actually created a community campaign with a couple of other people called Hertfordshire Against Holiday Hunger. And the purpose of that was to get all of these businesses and community groups that are supporting together in one place so that vulnerable people can access them easily, and to petition Herts County Council to step in the meantime, because we are so unsure about what the government's doing.
And when you set up this campaign, what was the sort of response to it? From local people, from the county council, how did they respond?
The businesses and our district council were really pleased that there was this forum providing, more information about this. In terms of the petition itself did quite well, but I think that there were difficulties in terms of councillors supporting it, and it felt like it was a little bit controversial, which I find shocking because I don't think feeding children should be.
I think there's a set of issues here, really, and I think I'm worried, and I don't know if the rest of you agree. I'm worried that there is a generation now of young people who are really going to be shouldered with the negative aspects of this pandemic, who have been unable to get into the classroom. We do obviously have digital education, but for those young people that really are struggling to get access to laptops or Wi-Fi, things like that, there's a huge lack of jobs for people coming out of university, a decline in apprenticeships. There's been a lot of criticism towards the government's Kickstart scheme. And I'm really worried that this will have such a negative impact on, if you've got young people coming out of university or an apprenticeship who can't get a job, what then happens to the young people that couldn't get access to digital education provision, or the young people that were too tired or too ill to do that work because they weren't getting proper access to free school meals? And my real concern is, I think in Hertfordshire, I think it's fair to say we're a pretty affluent area. I don't think that's inaccurate. But I think it's an enormous mistake that people make to think that because we are an affluent area, there are not pockets of real poverty in some cases in our county. And I think it does a disservice to those, not just young people, but also to, anyone who's really struggling to make ends meet in our community, when we pretend like everything is fine. And I do think the number of people that are struggling to make ends meet is going up. I'm going to bring Gabby in.
Yeah, just to sort of add on to your point about being able to get a job after uni. I mean, I'm in my final year of uni, so I'm applying for jobs now. And I've applied to hundreds and hundreds of different stuff in London, here, and all I've got is rejections because nowhere can afford to take new people on anymore.
And I think, when this pandemic started, I worked in recruitment. I'm now in my first year of university, so that sort of tells you how the job market was when I left my last job. But I was in recruitment and I was speaking to people every day who we could not find the work for them. You know, we went from a market that was completely saturated with jobs in the industry that I was in, to one that was then saturated with potential candidates who we couldn't find work for. And, you know, to bring it back to our local community, we've seen a lot of good local businesses close their doors on 3 separate occasions for lockdown now. And what's really sort of upsetting to me, particularly in Hertford, where I've lived for the whole 21 years of my life, regularly told I need to get out more. But where I live, less and less of those businesses are opening their doors when lockdown ends again. And when we come out of the 3rd lockdown, that's what I'm really worried about as well, that we're going to have more businesses not reopening. And I'm concerned about, you know, the knock-on impact that will have on voluntary organisations, on charities, and on the community, because it does a disservice to the whole community. But it would be unfair to say that the government has not had some success in parts of this pandemic. And I think we have to appreciate the furlough scheme. I was on the furlough scheme. I am very concerned about whether or not it's going to be shut down, you know, prematurely in the next budget. The support that's been given to businesses, I think, has been really important. And of course, the vaccine. We're now seeing the vaccine rolled out at a pace, which is really, really good news. And I'm really, really happy about that. And I think, you know, that sort of bridges us onto the how can we rebuild our community discussion as well. Just a quick, give us a yes or a no if you know someone who has been vaccinated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So
I've been vaccinated, actually.
Oh, that's fantastic
yeah.
news. That's excellent. How was your vaccine experience?
It was really, really well organised. In fact, I was surprised that I was going to get a vaccine so quickly, but I got one because I actually support people who are vulnerable in the community, and I'm a key worker. So it was really easy. I went to Lister Hospital. It was very quick. It was very well organised, and I can't fault the experience, to be honest.
That's really fantastic. That's fantastic news.
A really good friend of mine's a vaccinator, actually, as well.
That's fantastic. I know someone who was volunteering to help vaccinate school children as well, which is, you know, absolutely amazing. I'm really glad that the vaccine's being rolled out so quickly. And I think, you know, it's going to play a key role when we talk about how we rebuild our community, because now we're in a position where we can actually see an end to this pandemic as well. Who wants to come in on how we rebuild our community? It's a big question, I won't deny that, but over to Tina.
And before I go on to how we can rebuild, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the volunteers who have been, you know, giving up their time to support at vaccination centres. At the North Herts and Stevenage CVS, we've really been promoting that, and they make a massive difference in doing so. As well as that, our transport scheme has actually driven a number of vulnerable people to their vaccination appointments. So that's amazing. We're also working with Community Help Hearts to make sure that people have the correct information about the COVID-19 vaccines. And there's a COVID-19 Information Champions project, which I'd really encourage people to get involved with. It's really vital that we get that information out there and that it can be accessed by every community. And a number of communities are really vulnerable to misinformation. In terms of rebuilding, I feel that both local councils and community and voluntary sector groups, they know day in, day out what's happening on the ground. And I think the government needs to put their trust in local councils and CVSs to do what's best for their communities, because they are rooted on that grassroots level.
I'm really keen to hear from you, Joe, as well about this, not just in terms of how we can rebuild our community, but when we talk about organisations like yours that, as we said earlier, do so much year round, but have really gone, above and beyond throughout the pandemic to support the people that you support. How do you feel that you should be supported going forward as we come out of the lockdown, come out of the pandemic, to sort of, build back to where you were and even better?
I think, to be honest, I really needed the support in the beginning from the government, because we'd only been going about 18 months before we had the COVID news, and lots of people were able to claim grants and were able to actually furlough people. And because we didn't have a tax return, because we hadn't been going long enough, we fell through the net and we had no income whatsoever. And that's the thing that has been the hardest. And so therefore, it's lucky that we have been able to apply for grants. But I know a lot of small enterprises that do amazing things for people locally, and they have had to close because they have had no financial income. And I know people in Hertfordshire who are actually feeding the homeless at the moment in London. They're going down, and some of those people are volunteering and they're on universal credit, which I find really shocking. So these people are doing amazing things for our communities and supporting them, but they are not being supported financially by the government. And I find that quite shocking. So that's the support I really would have needed. I'm really grateful for all the funding that I've actually got and have applied for, but it has taken some skill to actually do that. And if you don't know how to apply for those grants, then you're going to slip through the net, and there will be lots of people who will not get the services that they really need. And but talking about rebuilding, so that's what I would have liked. Now I'm just really hopeful that everybody's going to get their vaccine and that we will be able to open our doors again, because a lot of the people that I support aren't able to actually access online services because they don't have computers, and also they don't know how to use computers or use the internet. And they have been really isolated because most of us are online. We're able to do Zoom calls and things, but some of the people I support live alone. They don't have computers and they don't have the technology or the knowledge to be able to communicate in society, and they are really isolated. So going forward, I'm just really excited about getting back to face-to-face social activity for people and work experience. So just looking forward to everyone being vaccinated and getting back to normal.
I'm going to bring Tina in on that next as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that a lot of voluntary sector organisations at the minute really run the risk of not being able to, open after the pandemic, and the government really needs to have a think about what they're going to do about that. And as well as that, we're definitely going to have a quite major mental health crisis, and at the North Herts and Stevenage CVS, we're already looking into this because we deal with elderly and vulnerable people, for example. We've already seen that the amount of calls for things like loneliness have skyrocketed, and we've got a plan to involve kind of mental health recovery in our Reach Out project. I think that's really important. And I think it's also really important that here we share the fact that there is a Hertfordshire-wide NHS helpline coming up for volunteers, because it is a really difficult time, and some of the circumstances that we hear about and work within, they're really tough, and volunteers are really in need of that support too at the moment.
I think that's a really good point, and I think there's a need for support for volunteers. Absolutely. I want to bring Sophie in as well, partly also because I want to hear what you think as well in terms of the mental health aspect.
Well, as someone who has struggled with mental illnesses for pretty much my entire life, I can tell you firsthand that our mental health services are overwhelmingly underfunded. And I think while having volunteers and services led and run by volunteers is amazing, and I cannot thank these people enough for the work and time that they're putting into all of this, I think that when it comes to rebuilding our society, there needs to be a massive push behind funding mental health services, especially since calls for loneliness and just general mental illnesses as a whole have skyrocketed.
I'm going to bring Gabby in because I want to hear her perspective, not just as a journalist who spent time in our community, but also as a student, because I want to hear how you feel students should be supported going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you feel the same, Josh, but I do think that students have kind of been forgotten about a bit. I mean, we're paying $9,500 for PowerPoints to be sent to us, and like personally, I have one online lecture a week, and then I'm just left to do my coursework. And they haven't really had any support. There's been petitions going around about lowering uni fees, which personally I don't think would help. I mean, I just think it would be good to get some support for students. I know some people actually get to university to get away from quite distressing home lives and spend time. I mean, some of my friends are living in houses that are supposed to be for 6 people alone because they're key workers. And like a close friend of mine is a carer for old people. She's going to work for old people and then coming home to a completely empty house. So I think there hasn't been any support whatsoever in place for students at university. We all got sent home at Christmas and then got told not to come back unless you're studying medicine or and things like that. So for me personally, my lecturers have been absolutely amazing and support me completely, but I have quite a close relationship with my lecturers because I'm a small degree and there's only 20 of us in the course. I think the students in classes where there's hundreds and hundreds of people, I don't think that they'd be getting any support whatsoever, really. And I think it's been quite a big struggle for students.
I think there's a few really key points that each of you have raised here. And I think it's really key that when we're talking about rebuilding our community, you know, particularly in Hertfordshire, but across the country, I think it's really clear we need to see support for voluntary organisations and charities, the ones that have got us through this pandemic, and those, you know, as we've said earlier, there are those that have unfortunately, not made it through. And I think there should be some kind of support to those people so they can get started again, to make sure that those who have made it through can keep going, to the businesses that have kept us moving, who, you know, as I say, where I live have been keeping the community moving through years of a delayed development as well, and then through the pandemic. I think we need to see local councils given, you know, better funding to provide better services for local people. We're in a situation in East Herts, for example, where we're now being asked to pay for food waste, part of your garden waste. I can't remember how much it is. And that's something that people are now being asked to do. But I think the key thing is this, and this is a point I want to come back to when we talk about public services. The reason the vaccination has run so well, is moving so quickly, and has covered so much ground is because it's run by the NHS, because it is run by our National Health Service, a public service. Test and Trace didn't work because it was run by Serco. It was farmed out to a private company. Similar issues across the country. And so when we talk about, PPE right at the start of the pandemic, enormous contract, I think it was 1 billion units of protection equipment. Not one of them was usable because it was farmed out to a private company who had not provided PPE before. I think it's obvious that when you're providing these kinds of contracts in a pandemic, it's going to be very difficult to go through the standard sort of procurement and bidding process. But you can't just be handing these things out to, in many cases, people who are friends of the government with little to no experience, when you've actually got in our communities small and medium businesses who can provide these services, providing it in the local area. And you can find businesses across the country who would have been quite capable of providing this. And I think when we talk about rebuilding after the pandemic, we have to look at our public services. We have to protect our public services and fund our public services, because they're the ones that have really got us through. They're the ones that have really protected us. And I think, we talked about this on the show way back mid last year, about the clap for carers, which I'm sure we all took part in. I'm sure you all took part in as well. And I did really, it was really, really inspiring to see so many people out there. But I think when we go forward, we need to talk about a proper pay rise for our key workers. And that's not just for our NHS workers, who, of course, we owe a massive debt of gratitude to, but also to the police officers, the firefighters, teachers especially, who have gone above and beyond throughout the whole pandemic to keep us safe and keep us moving. And I want to bring Sophie on this as well, because you work in a school. What's the sort of attitude towards that in terms of education?
I'm really sorry. I'm not sure I understand your question.
It wasn't very well worded, and I realised that the second I said it. How do you sort of feel in terms of, the way teachers... Actually, I'm going to give you a different question, because a better one has popped into my head. Throughout the pandemic, teachers have been criticised, teaching unions have been criticised for trying to keep our kids, quote unquote, out of school, for quote unquote going against the government. Do you think that's fair? And how do you feel about the way teachers, teaching staff have been treated?
Well, I think it's really, really unfair. And just thinking about it, if I'm completely honest, makes me absolutely furious, because obviously I work in a school, but both my parents are teachers. And I see that actually, even at home, they're working 24/7. Even in like a normal circumstances, they will be working 24/7, planning lessons, marking books. Teachers have an overwhelming amount of work that they have to do normally. But at the moment, some of our staff aren't very good at using Zoom and stuff like that. And there's been sort of this expectation put upon them to know exactly what to do and when to do it, with minimal guidance, if that makes any sense. And I think seeing articles with things like, oh, all they do is holiday all year, really, I don't know, it just makes me furious, because seeing how much work actually goes behind doing these lessons online and trying to support children who can't actually reach the online learning scheme. I don't know, like I read an article the other day that there's approximately 830 million children who still can't reach or access learning across the UK. And I don't know, teachers and just people in general really are doing so much to try and provide that for them. But to be honest, the community can't do everything. At some point, the government is going to have to step up and acknowledge what the teachers and community as a whole are doing for these children, and then they're going to have to do something themselves.
I want to ask a question next. I'm going to come to each of you in turn, because I'm really keen to hear from each of you, from your experience throughout the pandemic and just, your opinion as a person. I think it would be fair to say the pandemic has exposed a lot of inequality in this country, and has exposed a lot of issues, years of cutbacks in the NHS, like we talked about earlier, private contracts to companies that can't properly provide a service. Do you feel, or I should say, how do you feel about what the pandemic has exposed? Do you agree that it's exposed these enormous inequalities? Do you see that in our community as well? And I'm going to go to Gabby first for this.
I mean, it has, because it's noticeably people with more money have more ability to isolate themselves at home, basically. And, you know, it has really... Sorry, what was the question again? I'm a bit lost.
How do you feel about, the inequalities that have been exposed to the pandemic? Do you see that? Do you see those inequalities in our community?
Yeah, I think it has. I think something like this always is going to expose things like that. And I mean, it's actually quite a difficult question, because especially around here, I think there, as you said earlier, there are some pockets of sort of poverty, and then you can go down the road and there'll be a mansion. And I think it has exposed that, but it's also exposed the way that people will step up and help other people who are struggling with that. So, for example, with the free school meals, when all of that was going on, so many restaurants and pubs in this area were just offering their free school meals offering to make up for the government cutting the free school meals. So I know there was the pub, the Oak in Stats Abbots. The owner of that has done an incredible amount of work and delivering sort of food to care homes. He arranged for the free school meals to happen there. I think in some ways it has exposed that, but in some ways it's exposed holes that people have seen for themselves and are trying to help rebuild.
Okay, I'm going to bring Tina in next with the added sort of question. We've talked there about how above and beyond people in our community have gone, and we owe all these people enormous debt. They've done so much for our community. But how do you feel about the fact that businesses, charities, and all these other people are having to step up to fill these gaps that have been left by the government, by local authorities, by whoever?
So I absolutely agree that the pandemic exposed all sorts of inequalities which have been there for a long time. And I think it's really apparent that the voluntary sector has been suffering from a lack of funding for some time. But what I do want to say is we've seen the community come together and a real community spirit, from mutual aid groups to CVSs. There isn't a lot of money in the voluntary sector. We do struggle, but the voluntary sector is here, and you can always reach out to us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tina. I'm going to go to Joe next. What do you think, Joe?
I think there's huge gaps, especially for people who are disabled, who are people who are lonely and isolated. I mean, if it wasn't for organisations like us, a lot of the people that we support they wouldn't have any friends. They would be stuck at home. They would be vulnerable and lonely. They wouldn't have, there's no work experience for people with learning disability. Yet, only 6% of people with learning disability in the UK have paid work. And, that's outrageous. And we are one of the, people trying to support those guys actually to get some work experience so that they don't feel like they're written off. But the government should be doing something about this. It's not acceptable for 6% of people with learning disabilities to be in paid work. No, and 60% actually want a job. And people are being written off in the community, and they're losing their self-esteem. They just want to go out and get a job, and we're kind of filling that gap, and a lot of other charities are too. And also there were people during COVID, I really feel for the families and carers, because they've lost all of their support during COVID, and now they're forced into 24 hours a day caring and supporting the person. They've lost all of their respite, and that is so tough. It's going to be a big impact on people's mental health, and for families struggling to support people with really complex needs. It's really, really a difficult situation, and I think there's a massive gap there, and I think there will be a lot of people with mental health issues after this.
And again, organisations like yours are so important in our community. I'm going to bring Sophie in next. We're in the last sort of 10 minutes of the show now, so I'm going to bring Sophie in next.
I think that this pandemic and lockdown in specific has definitely brought into light the amount of sexism, racism, ableism, and classism that we have in our society. And specifically classism, working in the area that I do, we have some children who rely on free school meals, and that might be their only meal for the day. But then people seem to forget that these are the same children who then can't access their online education. And with very little support being given to those families, it has caused a massive divide in the children who can afford that and the children that can't. Because the children that are on free school meals and that be their only meal for the day are at a disadvantage anyway, because they don't have the energy levels they need to work at the best of their ability, if that makes sense. And I think this lockdown has, more than any of the other lockdowns, in my opinion, definitely brought that to light.
I think absolutely. This is as a lockdown, and I think part of this is because this is not only our third lockdown, but one right through the winter as well. And I think that has a real knock-on effect to people's mental health. I think, when we're talking about all these things, is especially when we talk about free school meals, we saw earlier on this year, possibly at the end of last year, that there was a private company who was providing £5 worth of food that was being paid £30 per food packet by the government. Where's that £25 worth of food gone? I was disgusted when I saw what was being provided to vulnerable people, and they were being told to live on £5 worth of food for 10, 14 days. And I think as well, when we talk about all these things, I think it's really clear now there's a growing gap between the people that are secure and that are able to support themselves through the coronavirus and through the lockdown, and those that are not. And my concern isn't just that gap is growing, but those that are unable to support themselves, that are really struggling to make ends meet, are gradually being left behind as well. So I think when we talk about rebuilding our community, we need to be thinking about these people. We need to be thinking about building a proper support system in our communities, providing support to businesses, voluntary organisations and charities, and funding our public services that are there to help people. We talked about mental health, schools, the NHS. We need these services to be provided for people. Of course, it's amazing that we've had so many organisations, people, businesses, all sorts of, fantastic volunteers standing up in our community for those that really need help. But that's happening because there is an enormous gap, as we've all heard. There are gaps that need to be filled. So I think that's something we really need to think about when we talk about rebuilding our community. We are in sort of the last 7-8 minutes of the show. So I'm going to do a quick question to each of you. What do you think is the one thing, if you could pick one thing, that the government or local authorities need to do to rebuild our community after the pandemic? I know it's tough, but you're going to have to give me one thing you think is really important. So we're going to go to Sophie first.
We need more support for mental health services and the NHS in general, more support for key workers, and that includes a pay rise and scrapping car park fees for NHS workers. And we need more support for working and lower class families.
We're going to go to Gabby next.
I think probably more support for voluntary sectors like the sort that Joe or Tina work in, and I think acknowledging some of the amazing things that some of the charities have done in our community, really.
And we're going to go to Joe next.
I think we need more easily accessible funding for people for small social enterprises who are supporting people in the community, who actually know what's going on in the community. They know the people in the community and they know what's needed, and they're in touch with people on a ground level and they know exactly what's needed and they can provide it. The problem is people like us, we're having to apply for that funding, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops to, it can take a month to actually write a fundraising bid. So, that's not easy. And there are people doing really great things on the ground, but they don't have the ability to write those fundraising bids. And I'd like a simpler way of getting funding in more quickly so that we can actually do things for the people that we know need help.
And finally, we're going to go to Tina.
I think more support for local communities, and that means, devolving power to local authorities. It means providing more support for the voluntary sector in terms of funding and resources, but also more support in general for those working within the voluntary sector and volunteers, and a real recognition of the time and the dedication of these people on a pretty much daily basis.
Absolutely. And I think, we've had a very interesting discussion today, and I feel really lucky to have heard from each of you, because you've all got, an interesting and unique perspective in this discussion. So we're right at the end of the show. So I want to thank you all for joining today. So thank you very much. I think, when we talk about the pandemic, as we said earlier in the show, when we started doing these shows last year, we were talking a lot about how the pandemic was impacting our community. Now, because there's an end in sight, we're able to talk about how we can rebuild our community. And each of our guests today have raised some really important points on how we can do that. And I think it's really important that we see those businesses, those charities, voluntary organizations that have kept our community going, supported on the way out of the pandemic, and really repaid for filling those gaps in our community. We need local authorities, local councils, councillors and MPs who will play an active role in rebuilding our local community, making sure that, the community has the resources it needs to get back on its feet. And that's going to be a big task in our community. And most importantly, I think we need to see the protection of and an investment in our public services, the public services that kept us going. We owe our key workers, the NHS, such a huge debt of gratitude for really keeping us safe and healthy throughout the pandemic. And we need to see those people repaid. We need to see them paid properly, funded better. And we really need to think about, this pandemic has exposed real inequalities. The pandemic will go away, but those inequalities will not. They need to be addressed, and we need to address them to build a stronger community in East Herts. That brings us to the end of the show for today. So thank you all very much for joining us. You can get involved online at East Herts Radio on social media, or www.easthertsradio.co.uk. You can find me on social media if you really feel the need to, at Josh Dean Herts, Herts, like the county. And you can get in touch, get involved in future shows, and tell us what we should be discussing, because at the end of the day, we want to discuss the issues that are important to you. But that brings us right to the end. Thank you very much to all of our guests for joining. And I hope you'll listen to us again on East Herts Radio. Thank you very much.
Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play East Herts Radio.
This is Bernie here, and I want to tell you all about my show. It's out and about in the local community. It's on between 4 and 6 p.m. every weekday. That's Monday through to Friday. Do take part and do listen up. So there are lots of little interviews with people in the local community. There's kids chipping in with jokes to try and keep us cheered up during these difficult times. We've got features on local bands, with their local recordings. We've got local singers taking part. We've got interviews with lots of local people. It's all about us in the local community. Yeah, so if you've written a short story, send it in and I can read it out for you. Do get in touch with us. We're out and about in the local community.
You're listening to East Arts